I saw her give this presentation, what's it, back in October, and I thought it was very beneficial. I tend to be a visual person, so she shows visual, and that appealed to me very much. And I wanted to share this with everyone. So with that being ado, Jennifer, if you will introduce April. And
yeah, of course.
If we can start the recording now, if
it's going.
All right, so we're already recording. It is, of course, my pleasure to introduce April to all of you. April and I have a long history together, and I don't want to say how many years, but I do have to kind of say that we have been working together since 1999. I know some of you might not even have been born back in 1999. Probably you were, but so April she's an inspector out of our Grand Rapids district office. So for those of you not familiar with Michigan, that's kind of on the west side of the state. And there's a really great diversity of sources of air pollution on that side of the state. And she is definitely one of our most trusted inspectors. She gets assigned a lot of very complicated sources, and she is really known across the state through our whole air quality division as being one of the go-to people for a lot of these controversial things. She has a really great way of just digging deep into the rules and regulations and really looking at stuff. One of the other things that I think is a real asset to the companies that she inspects and to, some of the other special projects that she works on is that she is very compliance assistance minded. So she's definitely puts herself out there to help companies when they need it, even though as inspectors, it's not necessarily the main part of their job. But you'll hear a lot in her talk today when she gives examples. She definitely is up for suggesting things that folks can fix on the way, not always leaping towards writing violation notices first off, but she's a great asset to our air quality division. Like I said, she's got a ton of experience, and I hope you really enjoy this presentation. I think it was a great one at our environmental compliance conference. And I know she's kind of twisting it a little bit today just because you guys are a little bit different audience than what we talked to last time. So April, if you want to go ahead and take it away, I think we're all set for you. So I'm really excited for you to give this.
Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Jennifer. And yeah, so, when I was asked to do the presentation and Mark reached out to me, I thought, how can I adjust this a little bit to really try to emphasize some of the issues that are common in the metal finishing industry, and also ways to identify overall tips that companies can use when they're doing their own inspections of their control equipment, and just really some of the things that inspectors from our perspective that we are looking for. And that way, these are things that I've personally come across, and I'll let you know there's about 3 of the pictures in my presentation today that I didn't take myself, and I think you'll enjoy them. Mark, things will look new to you because I added some photos since I knew you liked them so well after the last one. And I do have the chat box up, and will try to do my best to monitor any comments in the moment, but I'm also going to be looking to my screen to the left while I present, just to keep my eye on the presentation as well. So if I miss anything, anyone can kind of jump in and stop me, and we can talk about things in the moment, and we can also talk about them at the end. So I am April Lazzaro, and I have worked for the Air Quality Division for the better part of 22 years. And here in West Michigan, as Jennifer said, we've got a lot of things going on, and we do a lot of auto work here in Michigan, as you can imagine. And a lot of auto part suppliers are in West Michigan that are producing a variety of different chrome parts, zinc plated parts, nickel plated parts, a variety of plating activities that are occurring over here. So I'm going to start by just really brushing over some of the regulations and some talk about what we do in Michigan. And then I'm going to get right into the nitty gritty of my presentation, which is things that we've come across during inspections that not only can we easily identify as obvious problems, but maybe some other things that people don't always look for, but could be incorporated into a facility's operation and maintenance plan. So let's get going. And I think I started talking a little bit about this, but the main thing about metal parts finishing and metal finishing in general is that this industry is definitely not a one-size-fits-all industry. As you've heard and seen, we've got hexavalent chrome plating, trivalent plating, of course, nickel electroplating, chromate conversion coating, there's electroforming, there's electropolishing, and all the ancillary plastic injection molding equipment that is done prior to getting plated and the plastic parts. So it really is a lot of different variety of operations that are part of this industry that we think of as a metal finishing. So those companies that are using hexavalent chromium, trivalent chromium, are going to be subject to the chromium NESHAP. That also applies to anodizing that's conducted with electrical current. And there's other things like chromic acid etching, which is part of the plastic parts plating process that does not use an electrical current. So it is not subject to the NESHAP currently. So hard and decorative chrome plating, that has to do with the thickness of the chromium applied. It doesn't, I've always thought, okay, well, hard or decorative chrome plating, like one is a harder finish, but it really has to do with the amount of time that it stays in the plating tank and therefore the thickness of the chromium that's applied to the product. Here in Michigan, we've taken a different approach on our air toxics regulations, and up until the 2012 NESHAP updates, we were able to not only apply our Michigan air toxics rules to a chromium plating activity or a permitting action, but also those items that are within the chromium NESHAP that would automatically apply to a subject facility. And so oftentimes in Michigan, we would double dip, so to speak, and where a company might choose the fume suppressant or the wetting agent type of compliance approach for the NESHAP, Michigan would also require a scrubber control device on top of and in addition to that NESHAP required practice. Since the rulemaking had gone through the revision in 2012, we now consider that NESHAP protective of public health and no longer apply our state-specific air toxics rules to that. But I suspect that a lot of you know that a majority of these chrome plating facilities are aged, and a lot of the other plating facilities too. And that's really where we run into some of the concerns with the control equipment, the corrosive nature and the corrosive atmosphere in a plating facility. All types of plating facilities really lead to almost premature aging or just aging of control equipment and ventilation systems that you don't always see in other industries. And that's why we run into a lot of issues with the plating facilities. So there's also the area source NESHAP for plating and polishing operations. And I will be the first to admit that because Michigan has not accepted delegation for this regulation, I know very little about it other than it exists. So if you have any questions about that, I'm not your expert, but we do try to provide outreach to smaller facilities and let them know that this is out there. In Michigan's case, since we don't have delegated authority, this specific regulation would require an EPA inspection in order for compliance assessment to occur. And last year, we did update our metal finishing industry guidance. Our website used to just be specific to chromium electroplating, but we really recognized that we were missing out on quite a large portion of the metal finishing industry by just really streamlining to the chromium regulations. And so we added some components to our guidance, and Jennifer and I worked real close together on this one and developing some guidance materials for small businesses that have a plating or polishing industry. And Michigan also does have some specific source and process specific permit exemptions. And really what I'm showing you with this slide is an exemption of our guidance document that identifies some of those permit exemptions and how a small company might actually utilize this document in determining whether they need a permit or not for their process. And you can see that we've identified for our permit exemptions, there are a variety of things that we think of as part of the metal finishing industry. Die casting, of course, is one of those. That's where we're getting our metal parts made up to then perhaps get plated. Things that are vented internally versus externally. Some plating operations are vented internally. And really, we've come across a few companies that have decided to change ventilation from maybe once when it was internally vented to, you know, now they're really getting into an employee health approach where they've realized that we really need to vent some of these plating emissions externally. And so how does that impact their permitting status in Michigan? And this is one of the ways where they can look that up. And then lastly, on the right-hand side of the slide, it identifies those specific processes where an in-plant ventilation system, where an exemption from our permitting process would apply. So now we get to the fun part, and I'll let you know throughout the slides which photo I didn't take, and I think there's a couple, but we'll go through that. But for the most part, these pictures that you'll see are photos that I took myself on inspections at different types of platers. And when I do inspections at these companies, I often see a significant amount of turnover. So almost every time when I'm going, I'm really doing kind of an updated training exercise for the person that's in charge of the maintenance operations and the control equipment and ventilation system. And so I really do a focus on what should they be doing in their day-to-day, month-to-month, or quarterly O&M inspections, and what things should they be identifying that they can identify, correct, and fix before an inspector gets there and really implement that as part of their preventative maintenance program. I always say, look and listen, okay? These are some of the biggest cues to detecting problems, especially with some of those aged control devices, because it becomes pretty obvious to an experienced ear that if something isn't right, it probably won't sound quite right either. Air leaks are going to make a noise, and if it sounds different, there's a reason for it. Liquid leaks are also a problem. So can you see any leaks or liquids that are accumulating around seals or drain pipes? And the problem when you have air leaks in a control device is that it creates air infiltration up top, usually on the roof. And so that's going to directly affect performance below, and you're not going to get as good of a capture and therefore protection of your employees. But it can also impact the performance of the control device itself. So let's get into some good stuff here. So we'll start with this hexavalent chrome plating scrubber. We started investigating this company while we'd been there in the past. It had been a few years since we'd been there. And we got a tip from a surveyor that identified an unusual discharge into a nearby creek. And it was identified as chrome plating waste liquids that were being discharged. And in the case of this source and also others, it was an aged facility that was using concrete conveyances in the floor to transport their waste plating materials into their on-site waste pre-treatment system. And there was a breach in the concrete because of the corrosive nature and time that led to what turned out to be identified as a very significant and had been ongoing leak into not only the groundwater, but also surface water of the state. So that doesn't really have anything to do with air quality, but we talk between divisions, between air and water and waste. And through those discussions, I realized it had been some time since we'd been there, and it was time for an air inspection. As you can see, I want to say it was probably January or February up here in Michigan at the time of the inspection. And this is one of your more obvious cases of, oh my goodness, there's a significant problem here. You can see that there's a large icicles that have collected because the scrubber water was leaking out of the scrubber. This also has got a brown hue and discoloration to it because it was dirty and contaminated with chromic acid from the plating solution. This type of scenario also poses a safety hazard, not only for inspectors and facility personnel, but those that are underneath the roof. You can see that there's quite a bit of accumulation, and really all that extra weight that's sitting on the roof right there made it really a serious safety issue. So we didn't approach the scrubber at that time because I just didn't want to fall through the roof, obviously. But let's take a closer look at the sides of the scrubber. So on the left side, you've got the inlet, and the right side is our outlet. But you can also see that the sides of the scrubber have a concave look to them, right? So at one point, and perhaps on a long-term basis, there was negative pressure and probably a lot of plugging that had been generated over time in that basically sucked the sides of the scrubber in and really did affect the performance and structural soundness of this unit. You can also see that probably on the right-hand side, there is a thin line hanging down. Well, what that's supposed to have been was the pressure drop gauge, but those were non-functional. And it just so happened that the day we arrived, the maintenance manager had already conducted the day's inspection on the roof of the 6 scrubbers. And there's a couple more in my slideshow that are from this facility specifically. But he'd already been up on the roof to conduct his inspections. Unfortunately, when we got up there, there wasn't a footprint to be found. And so those confessions came out that really no one had been up on the roof in a significant amount of time. And that's why things got to the point at which they did here. So here's another piece of equipment, same facility. This is a nitric acid scrubber. And this picture demonstrates significant steel support degradation here. And really what happens, and I've seen it fairly commonly, even in new scrubbers, is that there's some condensation that occurs and there's a drain pipe that you can see, but the fan usually has condensation build up in the exhaust portion of the unit, and it ends up just eating through the metal of not only the control device, the fan housing, that shroud at the base, and really just ate completely through the steel over time. This is, and the previous picture are really pretty obvious examples of issues that you can clearly see when you're dealing with a control device that really were overlooked for a really long time at this facility. And I'll get into some maybe more nuanced items and really trying to make us work as inspectors in maybe finding some of these control device issues, because it's not uncommon to see some of this type of situation with these last 2 photos and really the decreased capacity and maintenance activities that had occurred here, but they can be a little bit more subtle. So this one here, I think this was a copper scrubber. So this would be the pre-plate for a hexavalent chrome plating operation. Often do a a copper layer as well before they move to the chrome. And you can see that we've got the same fan housing scenario. So this is on the outlet side of the scrubber. And we've got a lot of green staining that indicates that the scrubber probably isn't doing a very good job if we've got a lot of plating liquids and green staining from those plating liquids on the outlet side of the scrubber. And pretty obvious, although I have heard the story that that's actually mold growth from a variety of platers. When I've seen this, it's pretty common. Don't fall for that. It's not mold. And then in this case, as it being winter, you can see on the lower left there that really we've got a discoloration of icy liquids that has frozen on the roof. And that's just an indication that scrubber is probably beyond its useful life, but at the very least is due for some significant maintenance activities. Here's some visual cues. It's another one that's obvious, but you could see that over time, we don't expect there to be zero emissions from a scrubber, right? I mean, we still have an allowance of emissions that can occur from even a control device. And so I would think that if there had been an accumulation of, say, 20 years over time, it wouldn't be entirely unusual if maybe there was an upset at some point to see what we see on this scrubber, which is a chrome scrubber, copper scrubber again. And on the right-hand side, you can see all of that green staining on the stack. Well, just so happened that they had painted that entire unit 3 months prior to me arriving. And I'd been there about 3 months earlier, and I still had some questions about really what was going on with this unit. And so you could see I went back and saw that there had been a significant amount of green staining down the stack, indicating an ongoing droplet reentrainment type situation with this packed bed scrubber. The other thing that I'd like to point out on this slide from an inspector standpoint and a serious safety standpoint is that on the bottom lower left, you can see that humped area. Well, what that is a skylight. And it really highlights some of the dangers of being on a roof at any facility, but let's think a little bit more about maybe winters in your area, but certainly winters in Michigan, where an amount of snow that could cover a skylight is not unusual. And it's really, really important that if you're not familiar with and you're not sure about the conditions on a roof, especially in the winter and weather situations, it's not worth going up there. You really have to be very careful. And that's a perfect example of one of those hidden safety issues that can sneak up on you if you're not careful. So here's a not so obvious visual cue of a control device that's either had an upset at some point or some sort of emissions event that's remained unexplained in this particular facility. I happened to be walking around on the roof for a stack test for another piece of equipment, which was a chrome scrubber. And I realized around this copper scrubber, the rocks just looked a little bit different. And I was trying to figure it out when I was walking. And I'm looking around and I realized, and you can see the close up on the left and the zoomed out photo on the right, all those green interspersed rocks. Well, I questioned that, and the facility thought that they were just green colored rocks, but I wasn't really satisfied with that answer. So I asked them to do a little bit of more research there. And they took them down to their lab and found that those are actually rocks that are covered with copper plating solution because of some unknown and emissions upset that happened sometime during an earlier scenario. So when you're walking around, I find myself, I'm always looking up, and of course I'm trying to be careful, but take a moment to look down as well, because as with this, you're really not ever sure what you might come across. And I really was just working from a hunch on that one, but it turned out to be something worthwhile and something that I'm going to monitor going forward to make sure that we don't have an additional accumulation of green rocks on the roof here. What I'd hoped I'd see when I go back there next time is, either a removal or a replacement of some of that stuff, but that'd be probably expecting just a little bit too much. Here's another example of something that went overlooked by a very experienced company that has a very, very rigorous O&M plan, but they also have a high turnover to where there really just hadn't been training their employees properly. And those that were doing the inspections of the unit didn't know what to look for. And this is one of those cases where I provide my experience to the company and I guess do maybe a little mini training for some of their staff in the moment of, these are the things that I'm going to look for. And these are the things that you should be looking for when you're doing your inspections. So this is a hexavalent chrome plating scrubber. This is the inlet side of the unit. And you can see in the picture on the left, something that's actually pretty common in these old steel support system is that you can see a little bit of separation in those and you can see rust. And it's a common thing to have that occur just from the fact that water can sit on that edge. And I thought that was the case here until I looked a little bit more closely. And you can see in the left picture as well as the right that there's some striping and some staining that's going straight down from the corner of the unit. So on further inspection, which I don't recommend and I wasn't expecting and need to note to self, was I touched the bottom of that pipe that you can see on the right-hand side. And shocker and lo and behold, it was wet because what was draining from that was a cracked seal, and it may have happened during a weather event or who knows what, but it was cracked just enough that the chromic acid solution from the inlet side of the scrubber was leaking out of the base of that. And that what really was causing all of that corrosion that you can see on that steel support beam, because it leaked down and it was getting underneath there. And it really doesn't take a long time to do a lot of damage. That's how corrosive these solutions are. So when you're doing visual inspections, there's a few things to look for like this, and let's find the source of this. And also, where's the source of any liquids coming from and how can that be buttoned up? And if we can address that in the moment, that's my preference. But it isn't always something that can be addressed. So visual cues of water accumulation surrounding any pipes, any inlet pipes, outlet pipes, in the corners and the seams. You can see this is a PVC scrubber. It's older and it's been through a lot, and it's very easy for things to fail on these. And it's why the preventive maintenance plan or an O&M plan is really critical. This unit itself has some more issues that we'll see in a few minutes, but specifically under the NESHAP for chrome platers, there's a provision that says if the O&M plan that you currently are utilizing is found to be inadequate by the delegated authority, the authority can request an updated O&M plan. And so in this case, because I had a few different issues at a few different times at this facility, I required that they modify their O&M plan to include photographic evidence of their inspections, because of course this leak had just occurred 2 days before I got there, because they had done an inspection before I came for the stack test. Clearly this is not a week-old leak, because even as corrosive as it is, it's not going to eat through metal in a week. So that's why I required that they use photographic evidence to show that everything is all buttoned up on these units, so that there's some proof as to the length and severity of any violations that are identified. This is a photo that I did not take. This photo was taken from a neighboring facility and reported it to me under a complaint, and rightly so. So what you are observing right here is a nitric acid strip tank transfer of the waste. And during that transfer process, which goes into a semi truck to be hauled down the highway that we all travel on as well, there's a lot of agitation and heat's generated. And if the concentration of nitric acid and the metals is too high because you're trying to save money by only emptying your tank every 3 months instead of every 1 month, this is what happens. So basically what this is the chemical reaction, and frankly, a very dangerous chemical plume that occurred. And this case, no one was hurt, but the company had to make some significant changes. And you can see that that nitric scrubber on the roof right there is practically brand new at the time this picture was taken. And I had been up on the roof about 3 months after that scrubber had been installed, and there was already almost a fully eaten hole through the steel support system from a similar leak from the fan housing onto that steel support structure. It doesn't take a long time for some of that stuff to happen, especially when you're letting the concentrations and the metals and the nitric build up in your waste stream. Not even a scrubber can scrub out all of those contaminants. So they really were dealing with a couple of different issues with this unit, and hopefully I haven't heard anything from my complainant, and the company has implemented a more frequent procedure so that they're paying a little bit more to get their waste removed from the facility before any of the concentrations get to the level where this type of chemical reaction can occur. So please don't underestimate the dangers of the plating activities. So this is at the same facility, and I think the same unit as the leakage in the corner that I showed you 2 slides ago. So what we're looking at on the left-hand side, which I've circled, is this PVC scrubber unit is separating at the seams, literally. So that top picture where I've got the top circle is the top portion of the unit where it's separated away. And that bottom circle is where the actual inlet ductwork is separating from the body of the scrubber itself due to weight, time, and age, and failure to conduct appropriate maintenance. There was also a stack test occurring at this time. They were about an hour into the first run. So for hexavalent chrome testing, it is 3 runs that are 2 hours apiece. So they were already an hour into the first run. And on the right-hand picture, you can see where I've identified the arrow where these issues were actually located. And you can see that there's a ladder there, and you can see that on the right of the ladder, there's a sight glass, and that's usually used for scrubber inspections. You can lift up the plexiglass and look inside. And frankly, those are never fully sealed properly because you can always hear a little whistling, a little air infiltration. And I heard a noise louder than normal. And we were standing next to that glass, sight glass, and I said, you know, I'm hearing something over here. And I was talking to the company and they said, no, you're just hearing the sight glass, April. And I said, you know what? Could you go get a ladder? I want to look on top of this piece of equipment, of this scrubber. And so they got the ladder and we climbed up to the top, and that's where we found these major breaches. So needless to say, they had to halt the testing. Run 1 was not good, and they had to start all over after repairing the unit. You can also see in this picture those black stripes around the gray of the inlet ductwork there. And those actually are former repairs that were conducted prior to me arriving or just over time. But this is a scenario where the O&M plan was found to be not effective, and the inspections that the staff was conducting were not finding some serious and significant issues with the equipment. And I see a question from Jeremy here. So what percentage roughly were these facilities examples, small businesses versus larger, maybe Title V sources? And let's see, so the one we're looking at right now is trying to think, is a Title V source. This is a combination two plant facility where they do plating at both. Let's see, so this photograph here, this is an area source. So there's a few different plating operations here, but this is not a major source. And the first pictures that I showed you of the icicles and the significant acid degradation, that was also an area source facility. So we've got a combination of both here, but that's a good question. So this is an example of the duct tape that was required to implement some temporary repairs on the unit that we were just observing. They tried a more permanent solution, which is, I've seen it pretty frequently on these ductwork repairs, is where they take like a plastic and a hot melt pen and try to seal up these seams with their hot melt. Unfortunately, in this case, it required a full shutdown of the line to properly repair it, but they wanted to get their testing done. So they implemented the temporary repairs of some duct tape type material to get that airtight. And the concern with this was because the leaks and the air infiltration was occurring on the inlet side of the scrubber. And so when you've got basically dilution air and some changes to the airflow of the unit, you're really not getting very accurate testing results. And that was why the first run was invalidated and the company was required to start over at that point. That's probably the second time for that particular facility. I want to say they have 6 different chrome plating facilities, all owned by the same company in our area that I regulate. And I've had to do that previously. And you'll see an example of why there was an issue at one of their other facilities in a picture coming up. This was the scrubber also located there that was going to be tested the following day. And this was a chromic acid anodizing wet scrubber. And this is the scrubber housing on the inlet side of the unit as well. And you can see if you look toward the top of the picture that there's some sealant materials there, but as you travel down in the photo towards where the arrow is pointing, you can see that that sealant material is no longer present and that there's been separation of the body of the scrubber there as well. And so that was another air infiltration scenario that I found basically because I could hear that air whistling as it traveled across that spot and it didn't belong there. So they were able to more easily correct that deficiency. But again, I'm going to point out that this was a scheduled stack test and they knew I was going to be here and they still missed all of this stuff. So that's why we required some additional O&M activities here. So when we're out at inspections, we're also really looking at things from a multimedia approach. And a lot of us do that. I've worked really closely with several of our waste management folks, also with our water folks, and being that I'm currently a certified industrial stormwater operator, those types of things in water exposures are always on the forefront of my mind in addition to my air quality official duties. And so in this case, there was a stack test that was being conducted and nobody noticed the morning of the stack test that there was a breach in the inlet ductwork to the scrubber being tested and that basically chromic acid plating solution was leaking all over the roof. And so this is just the tail end of that. The other pictures I have gentlemen scrubbing the roof to clean it up in their Tyvek emergency suits to try and keep this from entering into the nearby roof drain. So if we hadn't have been there for stack testing, they probably wouldn't have known this was occurring. And it's another example of they did an inspection a few days before. So this must have really just happened overnight. And those kind of stories do start to get old, but you really still have to work with the companies to make sure that they know what they need to be looking for. And in this case, in the meantime, that scrubber ductwork has been fully replaced simply because it was no longer repairable due to that corrosive nature of the materials that we're working with here. Here's a picture of a very small source. They are conducting chrome plating in 55-gallon drums, as you can see here. Their ventilation system consists of those 2 wooden windows that they open and close as needed. And this source is subject to the NESHAP subpart N for hexavalent chromium plating. So if this is an indication of really what we have, really we've run the gamut of larger sources that have still have issues, even with the best maintenance programs on paper, but also, you know, occasionally we come across these little guys. And it's my understanding that this company is no longer operational, and the person that was renting the facility and operating this small plating line basically skipped out and left all of the waste there for the building owner to take care of. And of course, as the rules go, it is the responsibility of the property owner to take care of these wastes. So they're working collaboratively and creatively and trying to come up with a solution and a disposal that we can get rid of a lot of this stuff from this facility here. All right, so that's it. And I'm happy to take additional questions and talk about really anything in the industry that you might have questions about, specific questions about different sources, or I don't know, I'm open to talk about whatever you'd like to talk about.
Thank you, April. I am curious, with chrome plating, have you seen any new chrome platers enter the market? And if so, are they large businesses or are they small businesses that are doing it contractually?
I'm trying to think. What I've seen is a lot of rebuilds of existing facilities. And, you know, there was a change in interpretation in the NESHAP for what is considered reconstruction that's maybe has some value to discuss in consideration of your question. And really some of these platers that are from maybe the late 60s, the 70s, even the 80s or 90s, they're really starting to show some of that degradation that I've shown you in the photos. And originally the interpretation of the chrome NESHAP was that a replacement of the plating tank itself was considered reconstruction. And so it happens fairly frequently that companies, you know, either get a new tank or they're swapping tanks in and out and send them off to get refurbished and have a new coating put on the inside, a new sealant. And it was later clarified that the reconstruction of the tank actually includes all of the ancillary equipment as well. And the definition of affected source actually defines what all is included in the affected source, so that that's what you need to evaluate towards reconstruction as opposed to just a tank swap out. But I've seen, you know, several new like paint plants and things like that. But from a chrome perspective, we've just seen a lot of refurbishment going on.
Yeah, I heard that too. The rectifiers, I think, are play a large part of the cost. And so replacing a tank is probably going to be less than 50% of the reconstruction cost.
Yeah, correct. And then, you know, of course, you get into that whole concept of the reconstruction cost that you are evaluating is over the lifetime of the unit. And I've not met a plating company that has anything back as far as, you know, the 60s or 70s. Even if we can get 5 years of regulatory data from them, we can be lucky due to a lot of the turnover that I've experienced in the smaller sources. So that can be really a hard and a challenging way to go about things. So the end result is we really just want the tanks that need to be replaced to get replaced so that they can make sure that they're got integrity in the tank foundation.
So something has come up. I just kind of come to my mind. I recall about 3 years ago, an inspector went out to visit a business that does both hard and chrome plating. And apparently for the chrome plating unit, the operator was supposed to take pressure drop readings. I think you take it once a day, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And for whatever reason, the operator apparently didn't connect well with taking an action when you fell outside of that range. So they were just writing down these numbers without any belief that they meant anything. And then the air inspector found that they were falling outside the range, and there was no indication that any action was taken. And I kind of liken it to the frog in the pot of water, and then you turn up the hot water or the heat slowly, and the frog eventually boils. You get so used to taking in numbers because perhaps in this case you're so preoccupied with getting parts plated that you don't think about anything else. Do you find people get kind of lulled into a sense of that everything's all right and they're just taking numbers without really understanding what they mean and whether there's an action, a trigger point where they should have taken action? I don't know if it's an education, or a re-education, or the cause of that or the prevention of that. But any comment from you on that would be great.
I think when this regulation was implemented and those sources that chose the control device compliance method, so we're talking 20 years ago now, right? That they probably did compliance testing to demonstrate compliance with the emission limits in the NESHAP. And one of the things that's required there is that during the testing that you're establishing your operating parameters, and that's pretty consistent across the board with the federal regulations, is when you're required to do testing, you're establishing your operating parameters. And the NESHAP does say that your pressure drop as established during your initial compliance testing shouldn't vary. I think it's plus or minus 2 inches, which isn't a ton of wiggle room. And considering, the age of these units, and again, those same scenarios that I've been talking about, people know that they've got to write a number down, but they haven't been trained to understand what does that number represent and where does their number and why does their number have to fit into the range. And frankly, if anyone around remembers when the testing was done and who has the test results, right? And I found that to be challenging with some of those smaller facilities. It's very common.
Thank you. Given that Michigan has a lot of automotive entities, do you find that and I don't know if there's any of the automotive entities that are doing any kind of plating, you find them to be more proactive, given that many of them have or have had an environmental management system, which theoretically is supposed to address any aspects as well as to address compliance obligations itself. So theoretically, those issues you've shown us, those types of companies should be more on top of that. Do you find that to be the case or not?
What I've found is, when there is a clear culture of environmental awareness, attention to detail, cleanliness, OSHA safety regulations, and other attention to detail for other medias, water or waste, it really seems to be something that almost is umbrella-like. And it doesn't matter if, if one facility is great with one thing, they're usually great with all of it. And if they're not good with something, then they're usually not having attention to detail to any of it. And it really seems to boil down to a culture where I found if I'm walking through a facility and maybe I'm either with the owner or general manager, and I've seen this a bunch of times, and I bet you Jennifer Dixon would agree, and we've talked about this in the past. If I'm walking with the president and nobody says hi to him in the entire place, and he doesn't know anybody's name or she doesn't know anybody's name, there seems to be a disconnect between what's happening perhaps in the office environment with what's happening on the floor. But when I see that there's engagement from management to the staff that is on the floor, that's where I can see that there's a true connection to everybody has basically a hand in the environment and safety aspects of it, and people take pride in it from that perspective. And I don't know, hopefully I made some sense, and that was a little bit of a ramble, Mark, but.
No, actually, I think it makes perfect sense. I think, it's a cultural thing, which takes time to develop. It takes time to make adjustments and change a culture. I mean, what is the saying about changing habits? What is it, 28 straight days or something to that effect?
Yeah.
And then bad habits, you have to unlearn and then replace it with something newer itself. And then the engagement between management and how big a gap there is between the management and then the people who actually are doing the work on the floor.
Right, and then let's throw in this concept of we've had a tough year fiscally in a lot of ways. And so now we're experiencing maybe that we've had a downsizing effect. And so where once perhaps there was a safety person and an environmental person, and perhaps now we have one person trying to do both, and maybe be the head of maintenance at the same time. And we really see that in those scenarios, it's so hard for one person to be on top of everything. And it can be devastating to see, because you know that they just want to do the best, and it's just physically not possible. There's not enough hours in the day. And
Right, yeah.
They can use some help, I mean, and a lot of times.
When it comes to repetitive tasks, that's where I'm a big fan of checklist. If you want someone to do the same thing the same way every time, then give them a checklist. Every day, every hour, every week, whatever. And so once they get into the habit of using it, then it hopefully is going to be predictable.
Mm-hmm. Right, and that's a great way of looking at it. And of course, leads back to, is the quality of your checklist going to get you all of the information that you need? So, what's on your checklist has to have value as well.
Right. So yeah, obviously a checklist is going to be like a bullet points. So if you want to dig deeper, so hopefully it's going to be like the iceberg. It's going to get most of it. Now, if you have to dig in deeper for some nuance of the rule, then the checklist might not be so beneficial.
Oh, and I see a last minute question came in from Jeremy as well. And yes, I've done a variety of multimedia inspections. One in particular at the first story that I told after there was that leak, and I was actually on the roof in the winter time with our hazardous waste inspector at the time, and trying to think. I've done some other multimedia inspections that were not at chrome plating facilities, but I've got to say that from a true complete failure to address anything, and the full disconnect of what maintenance was doing, and that the maintenance staff was being entrusted to be conducting these inspections, had to have been that first source with the massive icicles on that hexavalent chrome scrubber, because I think the first 5 photos were from that same small area source facility. And I'm happy to report that we did have a multimedia enforcement action. There were penalties associated with that. It was air, waste, and a water consent order that we entered into with the company, and they have replaced every single control device on the roof. And it's basically all brand new, and it's great. It's the best outcome. I was happy with that one.
Hopefully they're going to maintain that and not let it go bad due to inattention to maintaining the equipment.
Right. And we as regulators tend to get a little bit complacent too, because I'm feeling pretty good about they got all new equipment, but so I'm gonna, push them to the side for a while because I feel like I don't need to give them as much attention as maybe I once did. So you're right. Hopefully everything stays in line and they keep up on things.
Any other questions? Well, actually, I have one. Are these places that you go to that do plating, do you find any of them also use chlorinated solvents for degreasing?
Well, we've got a few that are utilizing that combination. In West Michigan, I think that we have one halogenated solvent degreasing facility left that I can put my finger on. So that means, let's say there's two, because I can think of one that I know of. For some reason here in West Michigan, they've really gotten away from that. And our EGLE outreach noticed that, we've had a variety of issues with the diamond chrome plating, but if I'm not mistaken, they're no longer using halogenated solvents in their degreasers. So it's pretty complicated, and I think people are deciding that they just don't want to risk it. The last one I knew of that was doing it, and it was a small degreaser, he just said, nobody gets parts clean as I do. And that was enough. That's why he had one, because it's the best. So yeah, that first picture with all those issues, they were operating a halogenated solvent degreaser that they did eventually discontinue. They had two different plants and were doing it at both, that they shut down both of them. So
Yeah, it becomes a problem. I know south of where I'm at, there was trichloroethylene that was discovered in a drinking water well. And so businesses in the area wanted to distance themselves from it. So if they were using trichlor, even if they had a secure system with sealed floors, they were still looking to get out of it simply because of a stigma now attached due to contamination that was discovered because it had a big impact on people's drinking water.
yeah, and the use of that was so prevalent, dating back to the 80s and even earlier. And it really seems to be one of, at least regionally here, a hot topic for remediation sites. And they're obviously, lasting in the environment as well.
Yes. So are there no other questions? Do appreciate you taking time to talk with us, chat with us today, share your knowledge, your vast experience of being an air inspector. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Yeah, and if anyone needs any follow-up, or feel free to reach out to me.
So we have next month, we have a colleague of yours that's going to be presenting. Forgive me, I have to actually look up.
Ryan Grant, he's pretty great.
Yeah, how to comply with industrial stormwater regulations. Much like you, I saw his presentation and I thought, I know this is an area that it seems like there are wide, the applicability is pretty wide as far as industries that are subject to stormwater regulations. And his presentation, from my perspective, included a lot of video or images, of which again, I tend to be a visual person. I don't know what that says about me, but I did like his presentation. And I thought, okay, great. And maybe it's a bit self-centered on my part, but I was thinking, great, March and April filled. Not that you're just a placeholder, but I did find your your talk very meaningful, not only last year, but this year as well. And I'm looking forward to Ryan's presentation. So I wanted to make people aware of this. I feel kind of good when the more people can get on, and we can kind of network and share information, and hopefully other people will step up and maybe suggest something, or even offer to give a presentation like you did today.
Does that mean I'm off the hook for a while, Mark?
Yeah. Well, think of it this way. The better you do your job, the more likely I might be coming back to you to ask, hey, that was a pretty good topic you mentioned, or that was a good discussion or a good question. So, yeah, it's not so much I want to put you on the hook, but I want to connect with everyone I think has something worthwhile to say to the group, and hopefully people feel they're getting something meaningful out of these 1 hour plus talks. I guess with that being said, I wish you a good day and a good evening, and I'll see you next month.
Thanks, Mark. See you later.
See you later.